It's 1977 and Africa is plunging into revolution. By this point, people all over the continent had had enough of European rule. These independence movements were especially affecting Middle Africa and Germany, who wanted to maintain their colonial possessions as much as possible. Back in East Russia, Khrushchev had won a third term as president back in 1970, but was assassinated a year later in 1971. The Russian parliament held an emergency election where Mikhail Gorbachev was chosen to take over the rest of Khrushchev's term. Gorbachev was very socially and economically progressive. This proved very popular among the new generation of East Russians, leading him to be elected for his first full term in 1975. Gorbachev expanded industrial reforms, creating more jobs and allowing the value of the Russian ruble to go up. He swore to take control of the issue at the Ural Wall buffer zone and calm down on Russia's nuclear arsenal. He even started Russia's own space program to help NASA with their ever-growing lunar base. East Russia began spreading their influence and formed a defense trade pact with China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Korea, and Japan, called the East Asian Cooperation League, or the EACL. Lastly, he also reformed the Russian parliament, making it similar to that of the US. His presidency would no doubt lead in now growing East Russia straight into the 1980s. The USA in 1980. Ted Kennedy is no longer the president. That title now goes to the famous Republican and former actor Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan came into office with a full-on approach, especially when it came to space. Immediately after he was sworn in, he promised to expand the US lunar base for the sake of defense against the German Empire and American technological advancement. Reagan's presidency would lead to what would be known as the Reagan Revolution, which was a massive shift in conservative American politics. Back in Africa, however, 1980 became the year of revolution. Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Madagascar would break free, and up north, a potential Nigerian revolution was brewing. Meanwhile, in South Asia, a three-way civil war had broken out in the mountainous country of Afghanistan between Afghanistan socialist rebels, Islamic Mujahideen insurgents, and the Afghan government. After years of fighting, the Afghan government and eventually the communists would both fall, paving way for a new theocratic Islamic state in Afghanistan. This new government would prove very tumultuous down the line. Back up north, tensions in the Ural buffer zone were at their lowest, and eventually in 1982, history was made as East Russian President Gorbachev met with German leader Kaiser Louis at the wall, and they both signed a non-aggression pact. That was the first time the two nations made an agreement since the Second World War. The West Russian government, however, was not pleased with the lack of consultation before the meeting, and so they closed their side of the wall, and East Russia did the same, triggering the Ural Wall crisis of 1982. Anti-West Russian sentiment skyrocketed again in the East, and Gorbachev claimed that the Westerners were trying to destroy the newfound peace. Boris Yeltsin, who was in charge of the wall, organized a new meeting between the two Russias, the US and Germany. In this meeting, the Ural Agreement was signed, granting free passage and movement of Russians between the two nations. With this opening, the big question was brought up. Is the wall really necessary? Back in America, the new president was on a roll. He began making big plans to expand America's moon base into a lunar city. He also introduced new and wacky ways of defending the US from nuclear rockets. Because of this, he was hailed as some kind of American savior. However, these plans also increased anti-imperialism and Germanophobia in the nation, which would lead to many popular yet controversial movies and films like Iron Dawn and Channel Curtain. Reagan being Reagan, he'd also begun putting missiles and military equipment on the moon in a plan called Operation Crescent. Tensions also began rising in South America. The nation of Argentina had fallen to a military dictatorship, and in 1982 they invaded and took over the Falkland Islands, which was British territory. The British Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, responded to the attack with ferocity and sent the Royal Navy to fight back. Eventually, however, the Navy grew tired of fighting, and with very little support from the US, they surrendered, and Argentina won the Falklands War. Because of this loss, Thatcher was forced to resign, and the UK Conservative Party had to choose a new leader. These losses also allowed Scotland to wonder if they should have really been independent by now. They just barely decided no. Also in Africa, Togo, Niger, Central Africa, and Zambia declared independence. Sumatra would also break free from the Germans in 1986. The Congolese jungle freedom fighters were pretty much annihilated by the Germans by 1987. It was this treatment that fueled America's distaste for Germany and German imperialism. In 1989, just as his presidency was coming to a close, Ronald Reagan visited a small Russian town beside the wall of the eastern side and made a historic speech calling for the destruction of the wall. Things in the German Empire are changing. Colonies are breaking free, and the Germans are beginning to lose their grip on their satellite states. Their own government has even begun considering reform. Thus, I see no need for the wall to remain up, and for Russia to remain in too. So to that I say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. U.S. President Ronald Reagan, 1989. Gorbachev would agree with Reagan, and on November 10, 1989, the wall was ordered to be taken down. Up in the Ural Mountains, rows of dynamite blew the wall to bits, while down south, Russians from both sides assisted each other in breaking down the wall themselves. The event was named the beginning of the end of the Russian divide. Talks started happening between leaders from East and West Russia in the hopes of reunification. However, they were quickly shot down by the Germans, who wanted to maintain as much power as possible. Even so, the end of the 80s would usher in a new age of Russian politics and ideology. The 90s would be nicknamed the decade of separatism, and here's why. First and foremost, Boris Yeltsin would become the third president of East Russia. Boris would immediately reopen yet another set of reunification talks, as well as start a new economic boom in East Russia and even China. 1993 would see the revolutionary invention of the World Wide Web, connecting thousands of computers across the globe. Meanwhile, West Russia was getting desperate due to their decaying economy and their lack of self-reliance with Germany. Speaking of Germany, their colonies were breaking away in droves. By 1993, Mozambique and Cameroon became independent, as well as Borneo and eventually Papua and Southeast Asia. Angola also broke free after a series of socialist insurgencies. In general, colonialism and imperialism was just frowned upon by this point. This kind of separatism began appearing in Europe itself as well. Lithuania and the Baltic Union were rebelling against German control. Slovakia simply began floating away from German influence, and Poland just went crazy. Iceland would declare independence in 1994 and would eventually join NATO. Also in 1994, the French people in both France and French-German territory decided to riot again, calling for France's exit from the Imperial European Union and French independence. This action would be nicknamed Frexit. Troubles were even arising in Germany itself, with economic problems and bad management from Kaiser Louis. It was due to this that independence movements began arising in German territory in places like Denmark, Benelux, and even Bohemia. Louis would die in 1994 and would be replaced by his son, Wilhelm IV, also known as the last Kaiser of the German Empire. The death of Louis allowed the French part of Germany to break away and join a now independent France in 1995. France, along with Iceland, would later join NATO. Also in 1995, apartheid was abolished in South Africa, and a new African-run Union of South Africa was founded, with Nelson Mandela as its leader. A now cut-off German-occupied Namibia wanted in on this union, and after a short referendum, they joined in 1996. The change of leadership would also allow an economically suffering West Russia to give in to the East, reuniting Russia in October of 1995 after half a century of division and founding the United Russian Republic under the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. Kaiser Wilhelm realized that he had to clean things up and get his act together. In 1996, he gave German Middle Africa a somewhat independence as the new Dominion of Middle Africa, which had a similar colonial system to that of Canada and Australia, with their own independent government, however still had the Kaiser as their head of state. However, 1996 would also bring a series of economic crashes in Germany, which would last for years. By the way, while the German Empire was crumbling, the Americans began making plans to put a man on Mars. In 1997, the Baltic states gained independence and united into one country. Poland and Slovakia also left the German sphere. Ukraine and Ruthenia were now cut off. It was at this time that the Imperial European Union was disbanded. In July, Denmark and Benelux both declared independence. Czechia would follow a year later. The Croats in Italy also rebelled and broke away in a revolution in September of 1998. All of it was one massive domino effect. The Germans, by now, could very well see the writing on the wall. Colonialism and imperialism were dead. In December of 1998, martial law was declared in Germany. This was followed by the collapse of the German government in February of 1999. The German Empire had fallen, and the Cold War was over. Many across the US and the globe celebrated, with US President Bill Clinton addressing the nation in Washington, D.C. Over in Berlin, on the night of the 1st of March 1999, the German anthem played as the imperial flag was lowered over the Reichstag and was replaced by a new flag, the flag of the Great German Union. Similarly to what happened with the Ottomans 30 years back, the Germans reformed. The monarchy, in this case Kaiser Wilhelm IV, was reduced to a powerless figurehead, and his role was nothing more than ceremonial, while the German parliament, led by an elected chancellor, would hold most of the authority. The end of the Cold War with Germany happened so fast. Never before had such a domino effect of rebellion, independence, and colonial loss of that scale in such a short amount of time been seen in all of history. Germany's loss of their empire was so sudden and tragic. Unlike Britain and Austria, whose empires faded away over a couple of decades through war and treaties or ethnic and racial division, the German Empire crash-landed in a series of unexpected events, which lasted over 8 years. It was also a coincidence how the collapse of the German Empire and the reform of their government came just as the millennium was ending, almost in a way that suggested that colonialism and imperialism was not to be welcomed in the upcoming 21st century. But the fact would always be there. To this day, while the rest of the world considers the 90s as a time of human triumph, technological advancement, and the end of the Cold War, to Germany, the 1990s will forever be remembered in their history books as the decade of secession and loss. An extract from Susan G. Williams' book, Cold War, The Fall of the German Empire, published in 2011. It's safe to suggest that this was it. The Cold War was over, the German Empire was gone, and there would be peace. But to the Germans, the war was only getting started. They still had their Prussian monarchy intact, and still had some territory overseas. What's more was that their economy was beginning to climb back up again. They still had the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal, the world's second-largest military, and of course, their precious moon colony. These facts would lead a new Germany into the 21st century with a new approach to both domestic and foreign policy.